Welcome to today's lecture. This afternoon, Stephen Hess will be speaking on Ungentlemanly Art, America's Political Cartoons. I'd like you all to welcome Stephen Hess.
Cheryl forgot to say the most important thing, which is namely because of a conflict in the airline schedule, I am going to have to tell the complete history of American political cartooning in 32.5 minutes. If I take 33 minutes, I'm going to miss the last plane back home, and then I'm in trouble. So I need your cooperation. You know, if anyone laughs, it's going to take extra time. And I'll miss my flight. So I'd appreciate it if you all hold your laughter till Mike Peters speaks tonight. Is that okay? All right. And also, Peters needs all the laughs he can get, so you're doing two favors for the price of one. So I'm going to rush through this, and first let's get some lights. Let's get a cartoon up here and some light. Can everybody see that? Is it like in focus and things? Okay. So we'll start with this cartoon, which was done by America's most famous cartoonist, Thomas Nast, in 1871. And he's aiming at the corrupt political boss in New York, Boss Tweed, right here. And when Tweed saw this cartoon, he's alleged to have said, "Stop them damn pictures. I don't care so much what the papers write about me, my constituents can't read. But damn it, they can see pictures." And if I ever write another book about cartoons, I'm going to call it Them Damn Pictures. And a little later, we're going to return to Nast and see how he helped to put Tweed in jail. So let's get to the next cartoon, and now we'll begin chronologically. And this is the first cartoon to ever appear in an American newspaper. And the date was 1754. The artist was Benjamin Franklin. And the cartoon is based on a superstition that if you sever a snake, if you can put the pieces back together by that night before sunset, he'll come back to life. So it was a call for the colonies to come back together, and within virtually a month, every other paper in the colonies had reproduced this, and so in a sense, this started American political cartooning. Now, the next cartoon, that's a good one. There. No, that's not the next cartoon. There should be a next cartoon. That's the next cartoon. Okay. It's not very important that you can hardly see it, really. But it is interesting that this was done by Paul Revere. So our first two cartoonists were Benjamin Franklin and Paul Revere. Revere, if you remember, was a silversmith. And so when times were very bad, in depressions, people didn't have any money to buy his fancy silver bowls. So then he would engrave these cartoons, which would be sold individually for a few pennies. And this is a drawing of the Boston Massacre of 1770, with the British soldiers firing on the citizens of Boston. Unfortunately, Paul Revere plagiarized this drawing from another Boston artist. But a drawing isn't necessarily a cartoon. A cartoon has to make a political comment. And if you would see here, it says Butcher's Hall. And that is actually the British Customs House. And by putting Butcher Hall on it, he turns it into a political statement. And so it's really Revere the cartoonist. During this very early period, cartoons in newspapers were almost non-existent. Newsprint was just too expensive and so scarce that readers would often be asked to save their rags so they'd be sent back to the paper mills. Let's have the next cartoon. This is the famous gerrymander cartoon, and there's an awfully nice story about this. In 1812, the famous portrait artist, Gilbert Stuart, was supposed to have visited a Massachusetts newspaper office where the editor was looking at a map of the newly created Essex County Senatorial District. And with a few quick strokes of the pen, Stewart added the head and the wing and the claws, and he said, "That will do for a salamander." And the editor replied, "Salamander, call it a gerrymander." And so at that moment, Governor Eldridge Gerry was immortalized in the American language. You can find this nice story in the Sapphire's marvelous dictionary of American political terms. Unfortunately, the story isn't true at all. The cartoon wasn't painted by Gilbert Stuart, but by a man named Tisdale. However, it does illustrate the role of the political cartoonist in creating symbols. And of course, the Democratic donkey, the Republican elephant, and so forth all owe their lives to American political cartoonists. The next cartoon. Okay, this is a cartoon also from the War of 1812. It was by the most talented cartoonist of that time, whose name was William Charles. And see, there's King George. He's sitting on the commode. And here's Queen Charlotte. She's offering him something called perry. Well, perry was a drink made of pear juice that was a laxative. No laughter, please. The British had recently been defeated in a naval battle by an admiral named Perry, so that's the whole history of that cartoon. Charles, the artist, was a Scotsman who had fled to the United States after getting in trouble with his church over a cartoon he did which showed a clergyman bouncing a bare-bosomed young woman on his knee while exclaiming, "O Lord, what good things dost thou provide for us men?" The next cartoon. Okay, this is called Rats Leaving a Falling House. The year was 1828, and there were now two developments that gave a mass appeal to political cartoons. The first was the adoption of lithography. It was a quicker and less expensive process than etching or engraving. And the second was the election of Andrew Jackson. This finally provided cartoonists with a colorful enough figure that created a broad interest and controversy. The cartoon is actually a comment on the so-called Peggy Eaton affair. You'll remember that the wife of the Secretary of War, who was a woman of not highest reputation, was snubbed by the other cabinet wives. And Jackson interceded on her behalf, and as a result, this led to the resignation of the cabinet, the rats here, with the exception of Martin Van Buren, who remained and succeeded Jackson. And in that case, you see Jackson's foot is on the tail of Van Buren, holding him in the cabinet. The others escaped. And the next cartoon, this one, Daniel in the Lion's Den. The Daniel in the cartoon is Daniel Webster. The cartoon was in 1852, and it illustrates a point that political cartoonists have not had the slightest respect for our political leaders. The gentleman there, of course, it was Secretary of State, and as you should be able to see, he's quite drunk. Also in the 19th century, the cartoonists pictured two presidents, Franklin Pierce and Ulysses Grant, also very often as drunkards. They never sued for libel. They probably had just cause for the way they were cartoon. In the next cartoon, there are three cartoons here. And it illustrates a point that much of the 19th century cartooning, the so-called humor in it, was based on puns. And probably the politician, poor fellow, with the most unfortunate surname was Lewis Cass, a senator, cabinet officer, presidential candidate in 1848. And as you can see from these drawings, the cartoonist simply never let Mr. Cass forget that his name rhymed with both gas and ass. So there's Cass, gas, Cass, ass, and so forth. Another politician with an unfortunate surname was Thurlow Weed. About any time you had Hamilton Fish, Thurlow Weed, Cass, the cartoonists had a field day. The next cartoon, I guess appropriately that we couldn't get him even all in the slide, is Abraham Lincoln, and he was the politician who was just finally put together to make life more pleasant for cartoonists. This elongated, ungainly body, the homely, prominent features. It was just a joy to caricature. And here we see the cartoonist making him even longer, even taller, they say, because he's just been elected to a second term in 1864. History may record Lincoln as our greatest president, but to the contemporary cartoonist, he was just another funny face. The next cartoon. Now we come right back from where we started to Thomas Nast and Boss Tweed, shown in this cartoon. And this is a nice story, and this one I think actually is true. This cartoon appeared in 1876. Tweed had fled to Spain, and soon the U.S. government got a cable from the Spanish authorities stating that Tweed had been apprehended for kidnapping 2 children. Well, what had happened was that a Spanish official had seen this cartoon. The official didn't speak any English. He recognized Tweed, and he assumed from the drawing that Tweed's crime was kidnapping of children. So Tweed was returned to the United States, and he died there in jail 2 years later. The next cartoon. This is a cartoon which was the center spread in a magazine called Judge, along with a rival magazine called Puck. They produced, you don't really get it in the cartoon, but they produced the finest, the most vivid color cartoons that we've ever seen in the United States. This cartoon has a strange and unusual history. It's supposed to report the results of the 1892 presidential election. But because a cartoon like this had to be prepared a long time in advance, well before the final returns were in, the magazine, a Judge, was quite sure that Benjamin Harrison was going to be reelected. Well, instead, Grover Cleveland was elected, and the artist quickly had to do something to change the cartoon to fit the facts. So the first thing he did was he put Harrison's face on Cleveland's body, which was just fine, except that Cleveland was fat and Harrison was thin, so it didn't quite work out. Then he added, oh boy, I don't know if you can even see down here where I'm pointing, this little monkey doing a somersault down here. Well, that's the artist. He added the artist doing the somersault down there. He also, let me see. Oh, on the elephant, you see on the Republican elephant coming out of the middle, he put an eye patch saying "overwhelming defeat," and so he salvaged the cartoon in that way. And clearly, that is one of the characteristics of cartoonists, not doing somersaults, but this type of ingenuity. Let's turn to the next cartoon. This, La Spanish Brute, is a cartoon out of the Spanish-American War of 1898. And it illustrates the viciousness and the propaganda design that's fairly typical of cartoonists in wartime, at least up to the Vietnam War, when American cartoonists were pretty good at depicting the follies of the country when we were at peace, but as soon as we went to war, they tended to become fervent supporters of government policy. And by the way, I should add that if you had looked at the Spanish magazines of the same time, you'd see the exact same thing. Usually you'd see the United States portrayed as a large, gross pig. So this tendency is apparently universal. Let's take the next one. I'm going out of context for a minute because it's interesting when we get into the question of wartime cartoonists and so forth. This cartoon is from the First World War. It's one of the very rare anti-government cartoons that you can find of the period. And it's called, At Last, a Perfect Soldier, at the head. The magazine that this appeared in was brought to trial under the Espionage Act, but they were not convicted. The artist's name was Robert Minor, and he could have been possibly the greatest American cartoonist. this technique he uses of a crayon on a rough piece of paper, which was then picked up by Fitzpatrick of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch and so forth, really invented by Miner. He didn't do very much. His work was just brilliant, but instead he became the acting Secretary General of the American Communist Party. That's not funny. Next cartoon. Okay, here we're getting into the war period. You recognize the great Bill Mauldin. This is from the Second World War, the Willie and Joe series. And the caption on this, by the way, is Willie is saying, just give me a couple aspirin. I already got a Purple Heart. Mauldin, by the way, won the Pulitzer Prize at this time at the age of 23. I'm sure that was the youngest. Oliphant, I recall, must have been about 28 or 29 when he won it. What was remarkable in that case was two things. First of all, he was an Australian who had just been in this country about 2 years when he won the prize. And secondly, I recall he and his wife once telling me how they won the Pulitzer Prize. At that time, it was given for a specific cartoon. Now it's given more for a body of work. And they got themselves a book of past Pulitzer Prize winning cartoons, and they drew the cartoon specifically to win the award. It was a terrible cartoon, very unlike anything he had ever drawn, but they just knew that that was the cartoon that would appeal to the judges, and they won. But here we have Mauldin taking the side in the war between army commanders and foot soldiers, always of the foot soldier. Clearly, the Mauldin soldier is just too weary of battle, to hardly impressed by another medal. All he wants is an aspirin. Next cartoon. Oh, before leaving war and so forth, we might as well continue the story through Vietnam, where cartoonists did, in fact, oppose U.S. policy. This one is by Zepp, Paul Zepp of the Boston Globe. By the way, Zepp is a Canadian. It is interesting the number of cartoonists that we've had in this country who are not from the United States. As I said, Oliphant, an Australian, Lurie is an Israeli, Zepp a Canadian. And this one is called Executed with Skill. The karate chop can humble any foe. Lyndon Johnson, and of course Richard Nixon just had the sorts of faces that cartoonists love to distort. Next cartoon. Okay, now let's get back into sequence. We'll pick up our story again at the turn of the century. Here's the most powerful political cartoonist of that era, Homer Davenport. And this cartoon takes place in Wall Street, where before the Sub-Treasury building there is the great statue of George Washington. It's being taken down. It's being replaced by a statue of Mark Hanna. Mark Hanna always had dollar signs. That's not very clear, but he has dollar signs on his suit. The little fellow down here is J.P. Morgan directing the operation. He always, poor fellow, had a big fat nose. Mike Peters, you should go crazy looking at this. This is the front page of the New York Journal. I mean, look at that placement of that cartoon on the front page. Would any editor stand for that today? He was also the highest paid cartoon. It was reputed that Davenport, who was lured away in the Pulitzer Hearst fights by Hearst, made $100,000, pre-taxes before at the turn of the century. The next cartoon. This is a strange little story, these two cartoons, because from time to time politicians have become so angry with cartoonists that they've either hauled them into court or these illustrate a case where they tried to pass legislation to outlaw cartoons. This took place in 1902. The cartoonist in the top did a whole series of drawings in which the governor of Pennsylvania, a man named Pennypacker, was shown as a parrot. Top cartoon. Pennypacker felt that a parrot was a bird that didn't add the proper dignity that he expected holding the high office of chief executive of his state. So he introduced a bill in the Pennsylvania legislature which prohibited cartoonists from depicting men as birds or animals. And of course, you can see immediately what happened in the bottom cartoon. The cartoonist then started to depict Pennypacker and his pals, as trees, beer steins, vegetables, and so forth, and simply laughed away that whole little effort. You're laughing, that's a mistake. Please, the next cartoon is, this is William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan was the youngest man to ever win a major party nomination, the first time in 1896. He was 36 years old, so there's little Billy Bryan. I should say, by the way, that this is a takeoff on a famous calendar photograph of the time. And of course, the cartoonists always had to draw quickly. They had to base their work on themes that would be quickly recognizable by audiences. So that as you go through the history of cartoons, it's also a marvelous history of the American social and popular milieu, what's going on. For example, in the 19th century, just time after time, you would find cartoons based on Shakespearean themes. Now, I can't recall a cartoon seeing a cartoon in many years based on Shakespeare, which I think may say something either about American education or about cartoonists or about both. But here we have one based on a calendar photograph of William Jennings Bryan. The next cartoon, or cartoons, all 1, 2, 3, 4 of them, are of Teddy Roosevelt. He was undoubtedly the happiest subject for cartoonists the early 20th century. Unlike Governor Pennypacker, Teddy Roosevelt had a sense of humor, and he was delighted by the cartoonists. And he once, in fact, said that his dentist was easier on his teeth than the cartoonists. When he finally reached the White House, in fact, in the Oval Office, he hung an old cartoon over his desk from his days as New York Police Commissioner, and the cartoon showed that he was not qualified for higher office. Now, the next cartoon, please. Okay, this is into the 1920s. The American temperance movement, prohibition, were particularly unpopular with cartoonists. Cartoonists not being known for their temperate habits. The most forceful of the anti-prohibition cartoons was done by this gentleman, Roland Kirby, and he invented this figure he called it Mr. Dry. It was a running figure throughout his cartoons. This one is Now Then, Altogether, My Country, 'Tis of Thee. When Prohibition was finally repealed in 1933, Kirby had no more need for Mr. Dry. He retired him, but he said he was almost sorry to see him go. He'd become very fond of the old bomb. The next cartoon. Okay. Actually, this too is in the 1920s. The cartoonist is Edmund Duffy of the Baltimore Sun. I put it in here primarily to show that cartoonists have always seen themselves as battlers against injustice and entrenched power, and have been. They were late and not very good on American wars, but they were very good on and in the forefront on civil rights. Even some cartoonists in the Upper South in the 1950s. And Duffy was particularly good throughout the 20s in attacking the Ku Klux Klan. Here he's saying, he has Uncle Sam saying, "Put it on again." As the Klansman takes off his hooded mask. This figure of Uncle Sam, of course, just keeps repeating through American cartoons. Roland Kirby, in fact, said it would be difficult to manage a daily cartoon without him. The next cartoon. How many of you remember Iowa's most famous favorite son cartoonist, Ding Darling? Anybody here still remember Ding Darling? No? Oh, Peter, see that? Yeah, your fame is very fleeting. Ding Darling was an absolutely marvelous cartoonist from Iowa. Although his work was reproduced and syndicated through the New York Herald Tribune. And strangely, the cartoonists in the 1930s were generally hostile to Franklin Roosevelt. That may or probably did reflect the conservatism of their publishers. Today, it really is quite different. Most of certainly the cartoonists who are syndicated and you see the most of have a great deal or total independence in what they draw. But at that time, it wasn't quite the case. And this is a cartoon, Halloween 1936. We see Roosevelt and two of his henchmen, Harry Hopkins and James Farley. They're stealing at the outhouse. The outhouse is labeled Private Rights. Inside the outhouse is a little figure. That's the way cartoonists in one form or another used to, and maybe still some do, render the American people. A helpless, little, confused man, sometimes called John Q. Public. Cartoonist in Chicago named Vaughn Shoemaker actually added the Q in the middle. I don't know why, and he could never tell me why. Just one day he added a Q. But there's a history to this cartoon too, because Darling drew this cartoon not to be depicted in the paper, but just for the private amusement of his co-workers on the New York Herald Tribune. But the publisher's wife, Helen Reed, saw it, and she told the editor, "If you won't use the cartoon, I'll put it on the women's page." So they ran the cartoon, and I'm sad that you don't remember Ding Darling. The next cartoon. This cartoon shows that many, this won the Pulitzer Prize, that many of the cartoonists of the 1930s were isolationists. This particular cartoonist is C.D. Batchelor of the New York Daily News. And there, see, he has war saying to the youth, come on in, I'll treat you right, I used to know your daddy. Powerful cartoon. But so often in that period, as you go through the old cartoons, you see that they've shown Hitler as a comic figure, a funny little man with a mustache, clearly not much of a threat to world peace. Next cartoon. But there was a powerful exception to that, and that was Daniel R. Fitzpatrick of the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who very early on recognized the menacing possibilities of Nazism and Hitlerism. And in cartoon after cartoon, this is just one of a series, he took the swastika and he turned it into a truly menacing, devastating weapon of destruction. Here it is, Poland, and caption next. I think also it's worth commenting on at this point, as we've seen all of these cartoons. Although this is a conference on humor, I protested vigorously when invited here that I'm not sure how I could fit in, because the great motor force of political cartooning has often been outrage, not merely the urge to entertain. I was being facetious when I told you not to laugh. There's not a great deal to laugh about. There is a certain leitmotif that goes through. There are cartoonists like McCutcheon of the Chicago Tribune, I think really primarily wanted people to be happy at breakfast and would just have very amusing little cartoons. But the Herblocks, the Fitzpatricks, the Roland Kirbys, the Homer Davenports, the Nass, and so forth, I don't think thought of themselves as humorous. They were furious with things as they saw it. They wanted to change society, and if they could make you laugh at the same time, all the better. The next cartoon starts to bring us up to date. These are two Herblock cartoons with one of his very famous inventions. World War II is now over. We've begun the atomic age, and Herblock of the Washington Post has invented a new symbol for a new age, a character that he calls Mr. Atom. As we can see, this is an early one at the top and a late one on the bottom. As Herblock kept drawing this figure, he kept getting more and more sinister. Like Herblock's cartoons of Richard Nixon, he gave him more and more face hair. So the first one on the top is a Mr. Atom of 1947. By the bottom, we have Mr. Atom of 1954. Herblock said then, I felt a good deal of satisfaction when people used to tell me that the Atom character gave them the shivers. But when they started to tell me that cute little Mr. Atom you draw, then I started to give him longer periods of rest. He was not there to amuse with that figure. The next and the last, we should conclude with this most disrespectful caricature of a president of the United States. I think that's appropriate. The artist in this case is David Levine, who drew this portrait of Lyndon Johnson for the New York Review of Books. It's based, if you remember, on a famous photograph in which Johnson lifted up his shirt to show the reporters a scar from an operation he had just had, and in this case, Levine has the scar in the shape of Vietnam. We've come through. I should say, Levine made an interesting, nice comment about this cartoon. He said, anytime I can bring a god down to human scale so people can say, gee, Johnson has big ears, just like my kids, I'm delighted. Okay, now we have gone through 2 centuries in 33 and a third minutes of American political cartoons. We've gone all the way from Benjamin Franklin and Paul Revere. In between, our cartoonists